And I also promised that, since I had to cut out a little early last week, I also promised that you would have the opportunity to ask any questions or dig deeper into Heidegger. Okay. If that's okay, does anybody have any questions or anything before we begin? Does that sound like a plan? I'm looking into blank screens. So I hope you're out there, everybody.
That works for me.
Well, thank you. There's some affirmation. I'd like to know there's life forms out there. Okay, so just to recap what we discussed last week, the purpose of art, Heidegger's take is that the purpose of art is very different from anything that any other philosophers or art critics have ever said, which is that art illuminates into the nature of truth itself. In philosophy, that was formerly the domain of logic, but and formerly art was preoccupied with beauty, but he undoes both relations and says now art has to do with truth. And he gives the two major examples he gives of this. We discussed the Peasant Shoes by Van Gogh. He argues that these peasant shoes, reveal the nature of equipmentality. That was his word. He divides up our universe into three things. We have equipment, we have things as such, sometimes he calls them inert things, and works of art. There are three categories of things in this world, in our world. Ultimately, we would hope to get to the thingness of the thing, to understand what is inert, because what is inert is not caught up in our universe and doesn't speak to us. Equipment is so caught up with us that we don't even notice it. And so, but art can be revealing of the nature of equipmentality because, as in the case of Van Gogh's Peasant Shoes, it tells so much. It can reveal so much about the nature of those shoes and how they are used and who uses them and for what. And they communicate more. They communicate maybe desperation or hunger or poverty. Now, again, when we're in the middle, equipment doesn't usually announce itself to us unless it is no longer equipment. The example I was giving last week is that my phone, as long as it's serving as equipment, see it's functioning, I don't really pay attention to its nature. I just use it. Equipment becomes, that relationship breaks down when the equipment itself breaks, but then it becomes inert matter. Okay. The example he gives to illuminate the thingness of things is the example of the Greek temple. Beautiful description. I've lost my notes from last week. Very annoying. He gives that beautiful description. I don't remember the page number, but he says that, the temple, as it soars up into the sky, it reveals the sky around it. Its situation in the mountains reveals the mountains around it. It calls attention to the mountains. It calls attention to the space. He also says that this temple sets up a world. Art sets up a world. It sets up a world of meaning. Which suggests that art is constitutive of our very being, right? From the very beginning, of human civilization, we have artwork and we have equipment. Equipment doesn't set up a world. Equipment operates in the world, but when he says that art sets up a world, it sets up a network of meanings and significance that kind of seamlessly fits together. And so he talks about how it's very difficult to talk about certain pieces of Greek art because they're taken out of context. They were taken out, like the artworks that sit in museums in Berlin and London, taken from Greek temples and Egyptian temples. They are separated from that context. They are separated from the world that they helped erect. He distinguished his world from earth, earth being the collection of inert matter. And he says what is remarkable about artwork is that it draws attention to inert matter. It puts the matter on display, right? And he says that, like, when someone is making an axe, the stone should disappear and you don't notice the stone. It kind of is ignored or hidden by the functionality of the axe. But what is remarkable about the artist is that the artist puts the matter on display. I was giving examples last week from this chapel I visited in Ireland last year, where the stone of the altarpiece, that was on display, or the marble in the pillars, that was on display, right? So the artist puts the matter on display and brings it to your attention. It brings it to our attention. There's the other issue that he talks about, the creativeness of the artwork. The making of equipment and the making of artwork also looks very similar. They're both a form of craft. The Greeks had one word that referred to both. Techne for the Greeks meant craft and artwork. And I mentioned that Plato was the first really to notice that there's a difference between the two. Well, the making of equipment, tools, looks very much like the making of artwork. I'm always surprised when I hear Micah art students talk about going to Home Depot and Michael's. Apparently Michael's is a favorite place, where you get little trinkets. I'm told by my students, like, you all are makers, right? Just like a carpenter is a maker, but you're making a very different thing. The carpenter is making a functional table or chair to sit on, and you are not making something functional. Ideally, again, I mentioned this would be a problem for Heidegger, this idea of design and function meeting. He is insistent that what distinguishes art is the absence of function. Or as he puts it, he says that in equipment, the createdness falls away, but in an artwork, the createdness comes to the fore. And it announces itself. It's prominent. The creativeness stands out, he says. So there, I've hit on some of the main points from last week. So I don't know if anybody's been thinking on it over the week, if they'd like to ask any questions. Anybody have any questions, lingering questions about Heidegger?
I feel like maybe I see the point you're making about like the conflict between like functionality and artwork, and like artwork and design. But maybe like functional artwork is bringing forth, like, making awareness of that functionality. Like maybe it's not, I don't know exactly how to word it, but like just it's bringing function instead of like bringing equipment. It's bringing the act of using equipment to the present. Maybe. I don't know.
This would be an excellent opening for, a research project later in class where you consider some artists who marry function and design and, compare their thoughts on it, their intentions, motivations, what they think they're doing and why they're doing it, and contrast with Heidegger. He wrote this, I guess, in the 1940s or 50s. Maybe it was the 1960s, actually. But this idea of functional design doesn't cross his radar at all, really. It's strange. I don't know when did that, can you all give me a art historical pointer when this movement really picks up? I'm so weak on this that I think it's like Swedish. I think of like IKEA.
I'm thinking
furniture.
of, I might be wrong, but I'm thinking of like the Bauhaus movement,
Oh,
and
that's much older then.
um, which I think the essay was written. I think I wrote down like the 30s. It was closer 37.
Well, then he would have
Wasn't the Bauhaus like also along with the movement of brutalism?
Yeah,
brutalism.
yeah. I feel like
Yeah.
that time period like was really bringing in architecture and
I think this was also along with the communist revolution. So the
Mhm.
proletariats are like, oh, making it simple and less ornate and like everyone can access it. I think that's kind of where it came from.
Yeah, which I think would be right around that same time.
I think they all happen in conjunction.
Yeah.
Hmm. Gosh, I don't know anything about Bauhaus. But I mean, there are some significant practitioners of what do we call this? Isn't there a term for this field where function and design meet? I know art students have told me about this in the past. I guess maybe we don't have any aficionados here. Sometimes I get
feel
some
like I'm being
fanatics.
very obvious about functional design.
I'm sorry?
I feel like I'm being very obvious, but like functional design.
Is that what it's called? It may be. You know
think
better
so.
than I do. Product design?
Product
Like the
design,
product
functional design,
design?
graphic design. It's just like, I'm not sure about the specific name, but I think those all fall under the same umbrella
Hmm.
because like
Yeah,
that is also to promote access. Yeah, sorry.
no, go for it. Blythe just typed in the chat here. She mentioned product design. Micah has a new product design major. It's only about 5 years old. Maybe this is a question I should ask. Anybody know Leslie Spear? She is the faculty member who heads up the product design division. She probably would have something to say about this. But it is curious. Why would he not have observed or at least commented on this? But for him, and this is something that, other philosophers of art have commented on, that, art pieces, what sets them apart is that they are unique and they're useless. They're not made for use. They're quite the opposite. I think Heidegger would object to the idea of functional design, because that conflates the nature of these two types of objects, equipment and artwork, and it would undermine, I guess, how art. I mean, what does artwork do? It puts into contrast. That's the way he's been describing it, right? He uses the word strife, right? There has to be strife between earth and world. And, equipment undermines strife, right? When you're using the axe, you don't pay attention to anything ideally, right? But artwork exposes the equipmentality and it exposes the thingness of the thing. That's what it does, right? So I guess if you make functional design, for example, if you make like a very nice looking rocking chair, you should put like some pins in the back so that when the person rocks back, it pinches them and they're like, oh shit, this is not exactly, this is not an ideal rocking chair. I just had an awesome idea. You're welcome to have it, because I can never do it. But if you do, I want to see it. Go ahead, Babette.
I have a lot of questions around, or thinking around, well, two areas of like where Heidegger would stand, and one is on architecture, because I feel like architecture is functional, and yet it also is an incredible art form. So I'm not sure where he would
That's a really good
fall
point.
there.
That's an awesome point.
Well, he did bring up like the temple, that's like clearly an architectural thing, and it's like highlighting space. So
what I will say, Babette's right.
Especially some of the more.
yeah. Well,
no, sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No,
Okay.
no, you go.
I was just going to say, it's really great you mentioned architecture. And the reason it's really great is because I think in architecture, you see design and functionality, they are married quite early, right? That I keep thinking of
Right.
like furniture design, but that's a late bloomer, right? Or, you know, however, I will say this, there's nothing, I can't think of any building that is less functional than a Greek temple. You ever been in a Greek temple? It's like cold. There's no cushions anywhere. You know, you can't sit down. You can't chill out. I'm thinking of like a Gothic cathedral. You know, it's like drafty and like humid and ugh. You know, it's not
Well,
comfortable.
I think something about architecture too is it's like, I think maybe why he maybe has a problem with like functional design or like furniture design or whatever. And it seems like, yeah, he's like kind of really opposite of like Walter Benjamin in that like an artwork is like a singular moment. It's like very tied to context. And with like furniture design, you're making multiples of the same thing. So people are going to be experiencing it in like wildly different contexts. And so like, how perhaps can that object hold on to this like very specific moment of truth if it's in totally different situations, which I think maybe could be argued, but I think maybe that's why. Whereas like architecture, like that building is a singular thing and it is specific to this one spot. It doesn't move.
Well, I'm gonna talk a little bit about some other examples I think that really make his point better, and then if Babette or anybody else wants to point out some buildings, you know, where function and design really meet, I'd like to hear him. So, why is he talking about Greek temples? When I think of Greek temples, I think of two in particular, Delphi and Sunion. And Delphi was the temple to Apollo. Has anybody ever been to Delphi? All right, someday when this pandemic is over, we'll all meet there, okay? Delphi sits in the mountains. It was a temple of Apollo, and it is a beautiful, it's a stunning place, a stunning locale. So when he talks about the Greek temple, I actually hear him, I actually think of he's referencing Delphi, because what do you do when you're sitting in that temple in the mountains? The temple calls attention to the mountains, right? You see where you are, you see your rocky perch, and you know, you see the sky and the peaks and everything. And Sunion now, and Sunion, well, Sunion is that's where the temple of Poseidon was, and it sits on well, Poseidon. What was Poseidon all about, everybody?
The ocean.
The ocean. So this sits on a rocky peninsula. It's actually gorgeous. It's like south of Athens, and it's in very good shape. It's well intact, unlike Delphi, Delphi is like a complex of temples. And what is the point of that temple? It calls your attention to the environs. It calls your attention to the sea that is right there. Now, of course, the Greek gods, they represented natural phenomena. So it kind of makes sense that the temple to Poseidon sits where the ocean is. Why is Apollo was the god of what? Anybody know?
I think like fire or war or
Close. Oh, Jennifer got it.
sun.
Oh, I was going to say sun and prophecy. Yeah.
I mean, the Greek gods each had like 5 or 6 things in their portfolio. So they would have been the sun, archery, and what was the other one you said, Jay?
Prophecy. Yeah, that was like the main thing for Delphi.
Sure. I think he was the god of filing cabinets too. Like they had all these different things, but his
he was the art of music and art. Yeah, that too.
Cool. But the natural phenomena that he mapped onto was the sun. Diana was the goddess of the moon, right? Zeus is the god of the sky. Hades is the god of the underworld, and so forth. Why do we have a temple to Apollo in the mountains?
Maybe since maybe you see like this sunrise earlier, or
Maybe that's
or like maybe the sun comes through the temple at like a specific
I
spot.
should have looked to see what direction Delphi faces.
Or maybe it's something to do with like the eclipses.
Sure. I don't really have an
Could be-
answer.
It could also
I'm-
be
I
like
also-
athletics, because like if he's in archery and sports and stuff, like the athletic like prowess to get to the top of the mountain to go see the temple. I don't know.
Now you're thinking. Babette?
And I was thinking more less around like the specific god that the temple is for, but in general, gods were kind of supposed to be living and towering above in kind of as close to the clouds as possible. So it feels like to maybe better reach the gods, you want to place that temple closer to their home.
I kind of agree with what Jay put here, that it's close to the sun. You know, they were rising, although I suspect you're probably right, Rosemary. It probably has to do with also the way the sun was rising and falling. And I've been there 30 years, so I don't remember which direction it was. But yeah, I mean, perched on a mountaintop, the point is that the temple deflects attention to the sun, and this temple of Sunion deflects attention to the ocean, right? It's pointing to the natural phenomenon that is equivalent to the god itself. The Gothic cathedrals in France, they towered above these villages. Just imagine, you know, they were the skyscrapers of their day, and you would have seen them from miles and miles away. And, you know, what do they call attention to? They call attention to the expanse of the sky, you know, the universe around the village or town, you know, that encompasses the whole, right? And function was not built into them at all, you know. So you guys want to talk about some architectural edifices where function and design start to marry? I think a little bit of early railway stations. Some of them are really cool.
A more contemporary one is the High Line in
Yeah.
New York City, because it's functional in the sense it becomes a walkway above all the cars, and they've built it in a way that you can come up and down the street, and at very kind of key moments that you would want to be doing that. And there's a whole aspect of kind of like indigenous growing of plants along the High Line and stuff. But of course, it's also an incredible like artistic and creative feat. And one could argue non-functional, but I just feel like that's where design and function really merge. And the other thing I would say is in more contemporary museums, in which newer museums that are built around the function to support kind of contemporary art. And so, and obviously the design of these buildings is incredible. So there is this merging of function and design in those scenarios as well.
Interesting. Thank you. Anybody else?
I also think of like some prison designs that we have. I think it also like stems from brutalism and just like that kind of style, but like the overall like viewer, like if you look at a lot of prisons from above and you see that there's like this like, I think it's like a panopticon where you can look just down at everyone, like there's like a hierarchy of how the prison is designed, and so it's functional for whatever anyone who isn't an inmate.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I was actually, I don't know if you're, Kat, have you read Foucault? Is that what you're thinking of?
I forgot that is mentioned. Yeah, I wasn't thinking of that though.
Okay. And when Foucault talks about the panopticon, which was designed for prison, but ultimately the architecture was used in other structures for the most part. He discusses in the 1800s, there was major, you know, architectural innovations in schools and hospitals, you know, of course there was a nefarious trend there in terms of openness, and the openness was supposed to supply like, it was actually a devious way to introduce surveillance. But nowadays, like, the openness of a school design is like touted as a virtue, or of any structures, really, like the openness of an office design. I don't know if you guys have seen the crazy new proposal for Apple's headquarters in Cupertino. No, sorry, not Apple, Amazon. Amazon has a design for a new building in Arlington, Virginia, where they're having their East Coast headquarters. It is crazy. It looks like a glass onion, but it's glass, right? And glass is now supposed to be like open and transparent and liberating and all that means. But Foucault pointed out many years ago that is rooted in panoptic surveillance. Blythe is talking about a psych hospital. Gosh, you guys are all talking about brutalism here, and I didn't brush up. What's brutalism? Someone tell me what brutalism is.
In one word, concrete.
I think of Stalin. Is that brutalist, Stalinist architecture? Is that brutalist? Or is it like the communist, like?
It's like I think it's like post-war, World War II building. It's like these like huge complexes, concrete,
Geometric.
very geometric. It was kind of seen, I think it was kind of like a utopian sort of ideal.
It's like utilitarian, but
yeah.
utopian, and like, oh, everyone can have a place, everyone can like afford this, and like it was basically they were trying to recognize or like basically they were trying to realize the communist agenda. It's like everyone is equal and we all live in like the same thing.
Yeah, and like concrete, so it's like super democratic, affordable.
Brutal.
Yeah. I find it really interesting, but yeah, it definitely has a certain look to it. There's I saw this exhibit at the MoMA about Yugoslavian, I think it was Yugoslavian architecture. It's like all brutalism, but like very modern. It's really interesting, some of the designs they came up with. It's kind of this interesting twist on brutalism. But anyways, yeah.
Interesting. I'm familiar with Le Corbusier. You guys know about him. He's often interested me for a while. He built many of the big banlieues in Paris, which are now the modern, basically ghettos, but they were housing projects at the time that were very affordable. Mostly immigrants were housed there. And he referred to his apartments as machine habitation. And that's machine habitation in French. So he was building machines for living, which is an awful way of putting things. So if that is brutalism, that doesn't sound very comfortable. I kind of anticipated, maybe it's my modern prejudice, I kind of anticipated that when we marry design and function, we would have something comfortable. And again, I'm thinking of like smooth IKEA chairs that look good and feel good. But now Blythe is excited. Lindemann Mental Health Center. I do not know it. I lived in Boston for a while. Is this
I think that's a good example of brutalism. I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, that's the psych hospital I was talking about. Like the walls are like this rigid concrete that you could like actually hurt yourself against. I don't know why the designer thought that was a good idea. There's like no railings like on the balconies and stuff like that. It's like really bad design.
Okay. Not cool. And Jay has sent us, oh my God, Jay, what is that?
That's the Yugoslavian brutalism. Super cool.
That's fucking crazy. You guys seeing this? And what's the deal? Was it pulled apart? Is it just an exhibit?
I think a lot of it, it's definitely past. I don't know exactly the history, but I think there was a lot of like political upheaval and things like that. So a lot of the buildings were destroyed or fell into disrepair. So kind of a lot of them are now like abandoned or falling apart.
That's
But yeah, it was this like big, I want to say the 50s or 60s, like huge government building, like mandates of like all these crazy modern brutalist.
So
wow.
New York Times has labeled this Yugoslavia as concrete utopia.
I didn't know there was such a thing. That's awful. Huh. Okay.
There's also like the Barbican Center in London is like this raised area that like tries to marry like urban jungle with brutalism. It's like a really weird space.
Yeah, it's Blythe. I know what building you're speaking of, and it's hideous. It's hideous. The other architect I was thinking of is Lino Bobardi, a Brazilian architect who kind of her whole thesis or kind of mission was to merge like design and function and to create spaces of leisure is what she spoke about. Spaces of leisure inside kind of like either inside art spaces or kind of community centers, and this kind of merging of high art and leisure together. Yeah, so that's another architect that I think of often in what we're talking about.
Interesting. Okay. Great. Great. Okay. Interesting discussion. You know, again, these are all very fruitful examples if you wanted to research further and see, you know, how and where and why function and design marry specifically in architecture. As I was saying earlier, I think it's an area that this is one field that really opens itself to that marriage more than any others, because you have to walk in and out of buildings, right? I mean, I guess it pertains to community design as well, to the extent that, I mean, someone last week was mentioning land art, but, you know, what about like urban design? But I'm getting ahead of myself. I wasn't prepared to think about that kind of stuff. Any other questions or comments or points about Heidegger? All right. All right, I'm going to move on if that's okay with everybody. Let's talk about Danto. So Danto, this is a different look for you now. I hope you enjoyed his writing much better than Heidegger. Danto was an American philosopher based at Columbia. He died, I think, about 10 years ago now. He's always interesting. He's full of controversy. You know, I don't know. I'm not going to blab. I'll open it up and see what you all think. How'd you all find this? Anybody want to share their impressions, general impressions, thoughts, objections?
I think I don't know if this is a thing, but like what really stood out to me, and this was very early on in the reading, was that he mentioned how there was a decline in defined imagery. And the more I read about on and like the more I thought about it, the more I started to connect that with like the death of God, because it felt like a seed of like doubt or like the decline of importance in divinity. And like as we continue to advance in technology, I feel like it kind of struck a chord with me that if God was everywhere and God was nature, and as nature was always the domain of the divine, like or outside of human hands, something that was otherworldly. We could take dragons in medieval literature as an example. We could take Athena and her domain of the woods. There was a myth of the guy who like looked at her while she was bathing and she shot him to death.
Damn.
Yeah, she was like, no. I think she changed him into a stag and then she sicked her dogs on him.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and then we also have the thoughts of spiritualism and animism in like Native American lore and Japanese lore, and those were always outside of the control of humans. And as we become more adept at technology and we start to basically take over nature, we start to believe less and less in God, and like that kind of made me think like the decline of divine imagery may have contributed a little bit to that. If we take the fact that it was from like around the Roman Greek period to 1400 AD, that kind of stacks up pretty well. And
Mm.
like the birth of the artist and the importance of the artist. And I think it was Benjamin who basically said that art, uh, art has to be touched by humans, and art is far more superior than nature in the way of like artistic value.
Mm.
And if we think that God is nature and the divine is nature, that is a very blasphemous kind of comment. And that kind of like led me to thinking about how Kant's the death of God. So that was my take on the reading.
Well, the death of God, Nietzsche is the one who coins that idea.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Huh, interesting. Makes me wonder about the necessity of iconography and faith, you know?
Yeah, I think faith was definitely rooted in what we didn't know because we made up so many myths about things that we didn't understand,
Yeah.
like the sun and Olympus, because we were talking about Greek and Roman mythology. And then we had the spirits of our ancestors, the ritual of sacrificing for or like giving honor to the death of a kill and like respecting all of that because we didn't know what was in the afterlife, just
Mm.
like general things. And like iconography became less relevant as humans developed more and we felt like we knew everything. And human hubris is a thing.
Mm. Wow, this really got you thinking.
A
Okay,
little bit.
awesome. I'm happy. Well, my question initially was innocent enough. Just what were your general impressions on Danto? So I'll pose that one more time, see if anybody else wants to chime in. Anybody else want to?
I enjoyed his writing. It was, yeah, obviously a lot easier to follow than Heidegger. I mean, I think he definitely has an interesting point, and I want to say I pretty much agree with it. Right? Yeah, it's like okay, that makes sense. But I also just like, yeah, I feel like we're still in the moment. Like you just don't know. Like maybe eventually we'll look back on this period and be like, oh, this was clearly X, Y, and Z, and now we're on to something else. But I think it's definitely. I thought it was I pretty much agreed with him. I think.
Okay. Well, I'm going to pose his questions in such a way that I'm not sure you will agree with them, because I think there are some troubling implications for you all as artists. But let's start with the very main issue here. End of art. Did you know there was an end of art? Did you know it had an end? Did you know it had to end? Maybe you wouldn't have gone to art school if you knew it was going to end. He, of course, is playing on the dual meaning of end here. End can mean end, but it can also mean goal or like end point, right? So, but it suggests the idea that there is progress in art. And this is a controversial idea that was largely coined by Hegel. And he mentions Hegel. Hegel dies in 1830. And Hegel is a hugely influential Enlightenment philosopher. He inspired Marx, among many others. And he argued, everything he wrote about a variety of fields, politics and art among them, and religion, but it was all underscored by his overarching view of history. And his view of history was that history progresses and that there and that we're moving somewhere, and that we're moving to some kind of end or goal or ideal state. Politics is marching towards democracy, he famously said, and he's gotten a lot of flack for that. He also said that art was progressing towards a certain kind of goal. He didn't talk about what came after art. That's what Danto does. But this idea that art is progressing, not that it changes. That's taken for granted. Yeah, progress is different from change, right? Progress is the idea that it gets better, right? Oh, geez, art has progressed. Isn't it so much better than it used to be? Yes, it is, right? It's improving. So why don't we pull some of this apart here? He tells us, I'm trying to decide where I should start. I guess I'm going to start with your first essay here. The essays I gave you, these are 7 essays, they definitely overlap in certain ways, and they do address the same issue from different vantage points. So I guess I'll just pick and choose when we get to them. Looking at your first one here, he comments a lot on this guy by the name of Clement Greenberg, who I believe some of you guys already know because some of you have already mentioned him to me. I only know Greenberg through Danto. I have grown to love him in my way because he just sounds hilarious. Not this week, wait for next week, but he has to relate about Greenberg. Greenberg, one thing I should tell you is that in the philosophy of art, there are 2 sides, generally speaking. There are the Hegelians and the Kantians. You had Hegel on one side and Kant on the other, and boy, they disagree. When I was in grad school many decades ago, my professor was a Kantian, and he said that he thought Danto was an idiot. He said it from the lectern. I went to grad school in Belgium. It was very formal, and the professor came out from a side door, went to a lecture, lectern, gave a lecture for 2 hours, walked out, no questions. And then the exams were these oral exams, one-on-one, where they would shine a light on your face. It was all very intimidating. But the professor said, the Hegelians are wrong. And for some reason, the Kantians and the Hegelians, they still dominate today. Today, what you're going to be getting is a good dose of what Hegel's philosophy is like, his philosophy of art. Lyotard, who we're looking at in a few weeks, he's an example of the Kantian way. I personally tend to lean more towards Kant, but I have grown to appreciate them both. Any case, Hegel's idea is, there's a couple here. The big one I'm going to start off with is this idea that there is a progression, and that you can actually even classify certain periods of art. And again, he saw that there were 3, similar to what Danto is going to say. But Greenberg is, your first essay here, he talks about Greenberg, and Greenberg says that Manet is the Kant of modernist painting. Manet is really momentous. Let's start with that. Why is Manet so momentous in the history of art?
Since he breaks the rule, breaks the realistic to the his style. It's not that realistic. It lost a lot of details, but people still like it. And there's a history, I think it's in, I forgot which gallery, but when Monet want to put his art piece to a award or something, is really famous in that time, but they do not choose his work and put his work to the gallery, which is which contains all the works that is not being chosen. And in that time, there are a lot of public opinion about his work. So
yeah, when I took art history many decades ago, I remember hearing that Manet was very controversial at the time, which always was surprising to me because I really like Manet's stuff. And I'm thinking of Olympia and I don't know, can't think of any others off the top of my head, but I really like Manet. And so I was surprised to hear he was so controversial. Of course, as a modern 21st century citizen, where we are familiar with people like what's his name, Serrano and Mapplethorpe. You're like, look at Manet, you're like, chill out, people. What's so crazy here? But what else do they have to say about Manet, Greenberg, and Danto? What else is remarkable about the revolution that Manet initiates? Jennifer mentioned some of it. I was hoping somebody might expand.
I feel like.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
He normalized like painting like the everyday person within art, because like Olympia is like a prostitute. She like holds eye contact with the viewer, which the people in the Paris salon found very insulting. That she would dare look at them like that.
Right. Rosemary?
I was gonna say, like, he brought the attention to the material that was being used, where previous to that was very like trying to make it look as real, like not realistic, but just like as true to life or representational as possible.
Good. Well, you opened up by saying he brought attention to the material. That's not was new. He brought attention to, I guess, the manner of representation, right? That's what they think. And this is the beginning of modernism, according, this is how, Greenberg and Danto argue this is the beginning of modernism in art. My understanding is that most of my colleagues in art history, they agree that Manet is the beginning of modernism. And this is on page 7, the bottom page 7, he describes this. For Greenberg, Manet became the Kant of modernist painting. Manet's became the first modernist pictures by virtue of the frankness with which they declared the flat surfaces, right? Some of you mentioned that, on which they were painted. In the history of modernism, from there through the Impressionists who abjured underpainting and glazes, to leave the eye under no doubt as the fact that the colors they used were made of paint that came from tubes or pots. To Cézanne, who sacrificed for verisimilitude or correctness, right? So yeah, so the point is, he goes on below to talk about non-mimetic features. It's no longer mimetic, but it is calling attention to, it's the end of that previous paragraph. The question then would be, who was the first modernist painter who deflected, there you go, the art of painting from its representational agenda to a new agenda in which the means of representation became the object of representation? So that's a more accurate way of putting what you're talking about there, Rosemary. The means of representation became the object of representation. Manet wanted to call attention to the way in which this figure was being represented. Okay.
I guess I was going to say that wasn't there kind of a shift in like the self-awareness of like being aware that while you're making, you're also kind of commenting on what you're making, and there's this kind of like dual level of purpose, and that you're like talking about art while making art, or your work is referencing art in and of itself, kind of thing.
Yeah, I put in the chat, art becomes increasingly self-conscious and self-referential. And I don't mean it like in a painting about a painting. It's like, Manet commenting on Monet. It's more, it's referencing, it's self-referential in that it's referencing the nature and the means of representation itself, right? It's putting the representation on display, the means of representation. Interesting point here early on in this first chapter, he says that surrealism is outside the pale of history. That sucks. Sucks for surrealism. Why? What's wrong with poor old surrealism? What does it mean to say it's outside the pale of history? Anybody going to stand up for surrealism here?
I am, because I love it.
What does it mean? Let's see what he means first. What does it mean?
What he's meaning is that it's outside the dominant arc that shapes kind of a popular demand or a popular discourse. What is like claimed as the capital history. Surrealism doesn't follow the narrative or the storyline in a way that kind of leads from one point to the next. It kind of stays outside of that. I think.
You're right. But my next question is how? Why? How does it stand out? Anybody?
Well, I guess like modernism was increasingly moving more and more towards like purity of form and medium and like abstraction. And surrealism was like taking it right back to these representational forms, even though it's, I mean, I guess I read it as not Danto necessarily saying that surrealism was out of the history, but that the general narrative excludes it. So I would agree with Babette that I don't think it should be excluded, but yeah, sometimes it is.
Well, and also,
Oh, Babette, we're losing you.
focus was a dreamscape, and sorry.
Your comment sounded like a dream state. That was pretty freaky. We lost you, Babette. Did you want to repeat what you said?
Yeah, I think I might be going through a patchy area, but I'll voice my love for surrealism later. Other than just that surrealism felt like it was following a Freudian kind of dreamscape exploration, and modernism was so much more logical, analytical, and kind of again, that what you had said.
But also don't forget the difference. What is the principal revolution that Manet kicked off that Cézanne was that Cézanne was carrying on as well? And how I imagine, I guess Dali is one of our surrealists, right? How does Dali's agenda differ from the agenda of Manet?
Well, I feel like maybe Manet and like Cézanne were very much like the perception and like the day to day and like the immediate moment, and like how we really like maybe like how we actually see, or trying to like kind of capture that. Whereas like surrealism was more about these like imaginary states, or like dream states. It was like kind of removed from the like actual like experience of reality.
Well, you said it a minute ago. Like, if you look at Dali's work, it's highly representational. He does beautiful renderings, very lifelike, of human subjects, for example. Human beings persons that he's going to depict look very different from Cézanne's beings, right? Or Gauguin, for that matter. So whereas Manet and Cézanne and modernists are creating, they're on purpose problematizing the means of representation to call it to your attention. That, I think the point is that that's not the case for surrealism. Surrealism reverts to a kind of representationalism because its agenda is to talk about the unconscious, right? And dream states, right? But the interesting point is that it is supposedly beyond, outside the pale of history. Okay. Now, surrealism, I guess that's the 1930s, 40s, right? Chronologically speaking, it fits with modernism, but it doesn't fit ideologically or theoretically. It's an outlier, right? It's doing something completely different. We'll see that more in a little bit, but let's get to the meat, because what comes next is, he distinguishes also surrealism from contemporary art. Contemporary art is a different animal altogether. Contemporary art is not beyond the pale of history. It is beyond is like outside. Oh, guys, I think he described what that word pale means. For those of you who aren't familiar, the pale. What's the pale? You guys know what the pale is? Where that term comes from, anybody? Not sure. Okay. The pale was the wall around Dublin in Ireland. And when the English conquered and were colonizing Ireland, they were inside the pale and the savage Irish were outside the pale. And I say this with inner resentment because my mother's from Ireland. We were the savages. So beyond the pale is a very, it's a thoroughly, it's become a very common saying now. So beyond the pale means it's like excised. It's just out, right? So surrealism is beyond the pale. It doesn't fit with the narrative. It's like chronologically it did, but ideologically it did. So they kind of butted it out. Contemporary art burns the whole shit down. It doesn't try to fit in with the narrative. It doesn't get kicked out of the narrative. It just destroys the narrative. It's just bam, done. It is no period in the history of art at all. So therefore it would not be included or excluded. It is after any such periods of art. He says that contemporary art is post-historical. Well, what else? Why is contemporary art such a rupture? I'll leave it to you guys to tell me. Why is contemporary art such a rupture? What does contemporary art do that is so jarring to the history of art?
It doesn't stick to a linear timeline. It doesn't reference itself from like a linear timeline standpoint. It kind of is like, it is like saying can use anything, we can source anything. There all is art. There is no what by the pale. It's just like all everything. But Danto, he says like that doesn't mean that then there isn't good and bad art, but it's just that all can be art, I guess.
Right. So let me just go ahead.
But I think also like it separated like the art work from like the object. Like he says like it moved into this like realm of ideas. So that like opened up, any material could be an artwork, so like anything could be used. And it's more about the ideas rather than like the object specifically.
Very good. And he's pretty specific about a date, 1962. What happened? What did he see? Changed his world. Became a man. Opened his eyes. What was it, everybody?
Was it the Brillo box?
Yeah, by Warhol. Why is Brillo boxes? Why was that so momentous? You guys know what? Maybe we should talk about Brillo boxes first. You guys know what Brillo is? We have international.
Aren't they like cleaning pads or something?
Yeah, Brillo pads. They're cleaning pads.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Why was this so momentous to him?
Well, it was. Oh, sorry. Oh, well,
It's okay.
sorry. It was like impossible to tell whether it was artwork or not. It was in a gallery setting, but it was like, this is just like, what separates this object, which is an object you buy in a store? How does that make that art?
Good. Kat, you want to say something?
I was just gonna say the same thing, that I guess he just had this grand realization that the like art can start to like define itself on its own terms. Like the artist can do that with any ordinary object now. And that's kind of like a dangerous territory to get into, I guess.
Yeah, I'm going to show you the one image here of the Brillo pads. I particularly like this image because I'll do that in a second, because Andy's sitting in there. And I really like Andy's face. I've really come to appreciate Andy Warhol after reading Danto a couple times. And next week, I'll show you an interview with him. You know, Danto really thinks that Warhol is a revolutionary figure in a variety of ways. What's kind of funny about that is that Warhol never claimed to be, you know, quite the opposite. So before class, I put this image up and I was looking at his face. I was thinking, why does he have that expression? He's not smiling. He's like almost scared sitting there. But let's focus on the Brillo pads for a second. So I don't know. What stands out to you about this exhibit? Or maybe it's too second nature for us to say anything stands out. I'm not sure this is the way the exhibit looked, by the way.
When they re-showed it at MoMA, it was like before MoMA got revamped, it was in it wasn't at MoMA, it was at Whitney, sorry. I'm getting confused. It was a long time ago. They like piled them just like free high, and it was like a scattered thing, and it looked like more regular than like these like big stacks that photo's showing.
Okay. Well, one of the things I want you all to appreciate, because Brillo is not a common pad. We talk about Brillo pads. When I was a kid, my mother used to use them to scour the dishes, but I don't even know where I would find them now. Why did he target Brillo pads? Why did he target Brillo? Anybody?
I don't know. I'm honestly curious about why Warhol targeted like a lot of the brands that he did. I don't really know anything about that.
Well, here you go. Campbell's. This is a little more, this is why I had this image ready, because I kind of figured that Brillo pads is not exactly the kind of product that we know well anymore, but Campbell's is. I was in the grocery store the other day and I was looking at all the Campbell's on option. Some of these I don't notice anymore, like cheddar cheese soup. But anyway, talk about progress. He also was a fond of paintings of Coca-Cola. What was he going after? What do you think?
Maybe it was like the quintessential like everyday American product that like every single person would have in their home. Or be like incredibly familiar with.
I like it. There's I can't see in my comments. Somebody want to say something?
I was saying consumerism.
Did you guys notice where this exhibit was first shown? I mean, the Brillo boxes, that is. He says it. It was on the Upper East Side. You guys know what the Upper East Side is like?
Wealthy.
He's kind of like, I think the Upper East Side is like extremely elite. And so I feel like there's like layers of commentary on consumption, in that like what he's painting is highly consumable. What people desire is the brand that is consumable. And then while anyone is watching this work, they're also consuming his work in a very like highly consumable way. So there's like layers of kind of that conversation going on in his work.
and probably also their general idea of art is like probably way more traditional, I'm assuming, and like old school.
Let me paint a picture for you. First of all, the two wealthiest zip codes in America are the east side and the west side of Manhattan, on either side of Central Park. The east side, the west side is more bohemian, a little bit, not much. The east side is the real snooty part. And I mean, Mamma Mia, okay, it's also where the Guggenheim is and the Met. So if you're in the Upper East Side looking for art, you go to the Met. And then he pops up with this exhibit on the Upper East Side. Campbell's. Who's eating Campbell's? You know what I'm saying? Who's eating Campbell's? Are they eating Campbell's soup on the Upper East Side? Here's a better question. Are the ladies on the Upper East Side using Brillo soap pads? You understand what I'm getting at? Who's using this stuff, everybody?
So he's like presenting, in a way, it's like he's presenting this like what they would consider like a foreign object in the same way that like when the British colonized a lot of places, they would bring back items to show
That's
off to
right.
the wealthy.
I have been to suburbia and I have procured the Brillo boxes. And Warhol was from, if you guys don't know about him, Warhol was from a very working class background in Pittsburgh, very humble beginnings, and gets into graphic design. And I personally think that Warhol was hilarious. And I think that this is hilarious, what he's doing. So you have to imagine it's a Sunday. The Upper East Siders have just had brunch with their mimosas. Like, let's go see art. We did the Met last week, and they go to see Warhol, and they're showed fucking sponges, right? Brillo is a brand we don't know anymore. How about like Dove or Tide? You know, Tide Pods, an exhibit of Tide Pods, that kind of shit, right? They would have been like, what is this? Their heads would have just exploded. And he thinks that this is huge. This is hugely momentous, right? This is not like anybody has been doing ever before, okay? And this is the bomb that drops. And principally it drops on the abstract expressionists, who were very serious. We'll talk about them next week. And blows up their world, and things were never the same ever again. Because the intellectual game is completely changed now. How so? How does Warhol initiate a change in the questions or the discussion of art? What has changed now?
This is just going off. Bye-bye.
I was just going to say there's certainly now a requirement to be have whatever art writing or art criticism or art talk be in association and understanding the like social conditions of people and the kind of like everyday politics has to kind of be brought into art discussion, and it can't just be about this kind of insular form and matter and I don't know, I guess art speak is a word for it.
Awesome. Blythe.
I was just gonna mention that you're saying about like the abstract expressionism, like not liking it. I also remember reading like Ava Hess's like diary. She was talking about like going she would do like a residency in Germany to like wait for pop art to like tide over in New York.
Right. They hated it. Hey guys, don't forget to use the raise hands option. I think that make it easier so we don't talk on top of each other. But I'm going to pose the question again. How does Warhol change? I mean, both of what you guys said is true, but there's one further step to take, right? Generally speaking, with modernism, his argument is that art becomes more philosophical, right? He talks about Descartes and the turn inward. With Manet and modernist art, art starts to become self-referential and meditate upon itself, right? And but this takes a further step with Warhol. What do you think the Upper East Siders, what was the first question that popped in their heads when they walked inside and saw the Brillo boxes? Besides, how do I get my money back? What was their next question? Imagine them with their mink stole surveying the Brillo boxes on the floor.
I would think they would say either, what is this? Or how is this art? Maybe.
They probably said both.
Yeah, a couple swear words maybe.
No, they were Upper East Siders. They would never curse. Right. He thinks the big question now is, you know, what Warhol has really initiated with contemporary art is that art is so self-referential, it even poses the question to the viewer, is this art at all? Right? That's what he wanted to say. I'm going to call your attention to what he's done here. Sorry. This isn't good enough because the Campbell soup can is not good enough because those are paintings. Brillo box is different because here's what you need to understand, which is again why this brand doesn't really work for us today. This is exactly how you would have encountered them in the grocery store. You would go, imagine you go into the Safeway and you see in the aisle piles of these boxes of Brillo. Suddenly now you go to the museum on the Upper East Side and those boxes are meeting you again, right? So what is he playing at, right? Andy was doing something really devious, you know. He was making the box itself, right? Well, how is that art? So, you know, this is something that you have to ask yourself. He talks about this on page 12 and 13 in your readings. He says at the bottom of 12 that the contemporary is, from one perspective, a period of information disorder, a condition of perfect aesthetic entropy. Kat pointed out, right, now you can do whatever you want, really. I think Babette made that point too. But it is equally a period of quite perfect freedom. So aesthetic entropy and perfect freedom. There is no longer any pale of history. Everything is permitted. But that makes the historical transition from modernism to post-historical art all the more urgent to try to understand, right? Why did this happen at this point? Definitively. So much so that it hasn't recuperated. We'll get the rest of the narrative in just a minute. And then on the next page, into that top paragraph, it says, and then the dawning sense that the absence of direction was the defining trait of this new period, that neo-expressionism was less a direction than the illusion of one. Oh, that's not what I wanted. I wanted the section here. He talks about Brillo box in the next paragraph. To use my favorite example, nothing need mark the difference outwardly between Andy Warhol's Brillo box and the Brillo box in the supermarket. They look the same. And conceptual art demonstrated that there need not even be a palpable visual object for something to be a work of visual art. That meant that you could no longer teach the meaning of art by example. It meant that as far as appearances were concerned, anything could be a work of art. And it meant that if you were going to find out what art was, you had to turn from sense experience to thought. You had, in brief, to turn to philosophy. Right. And then he mentioned at the bottom of this page, this was Hegel's great idea, is that art, when it reaches its end, becomes philosophical. Technically, for Hegel, it sheds art altogether. The highest form of art, according to Hegel, was poetry. He ranked the arts. Architecture at the bottom, painting, sculpture in the middle, poetry at the top. And why is poetry at the top? Because at poetry, in Hegel's view, you were on the precipice of shedding art altogether and drifting off into abstraction, right? He says of Andy Warhol, he says, you could no longer teach the meaning of art by example, right? I think that's really interesting. Let me pause there for a second, see if anybody has any questions or comments about the argument. Anybody have any questions? Right. So after the end of art, that is now with contemporary art, an artwork now poses the essential question, why am I a work of art? That is now it. And he says, naturally, of course, the museum had trouble with this. Why? Why did contemporary art pose a problem for museums? The MoMA in particular.
Well, up until like that point, they were like doing room per movement or room per time period. And so there was a switch because like I think someone said earlier that like contemporary art draws on like lots of different movements. It's not a linear timeline. It became hard for them to create a curated like progression for the space.
Thank you. Anybody else?
And contemporary art is like not pure. It mixes a lot of different styles inside, and it breaks the barrier between the art and the normal life. Like it makes the art more closer to the public, so it's more acceptable than before. Oh, and it's not see the aesthetic of art, like the beauty that's important, and more about the meaning of the art.
Awesome. Can you guys think of some contemporary artworks that have really been a pain in the ass for curators? Let's suppose that a curator one day was presented with Warhol's Brillo boxes and was like, what the fuck? Where do I put this? Right. As Blythe was explaining it, right, like you put the Impressionists over there and the abstract Expressionists go over there. And then Jennifer points out there's variation in various styles as well. Can you guys think of some other problematic ones?
I think about like two pieces. One is the banana. I don't know, it's very famous, like before, like the banana and pioneer thing. And there is also a light. I write it before that light, but I forgot the author. Like it's in the Baltimore Museum of Art. The purple light, that one is totally different, and it's like have more communication with the people who come who've been there. So
Awesome. Hey, you know, this is one of the advantages of being online. There aren't many, but if you want to find the link, post it down there for any of these, and then your classmates can see them. Jay is talking about a time that a cleaning lady put a piece into a trash can. God.
Yeah, I think it was a Damien Hirst piece, and it was just like trash. Like it literally just looked like trash. And then like they had the whole exhibition, and then the janitor didn't know, I guess, and put it in the trash.
Good.
And the one of the largest concerns for curators with like work like Andy's was just like, how do you buy it?
What do you buy?
What do you buy, and how is it archived? You know, like all of a sudden that becomes extremely difficult.
Isn't that funny?
Or works, I think, I'm totally blanking on the name, but there's one famous artist who does like pretty much like straight up appropriations. He just like literally takes someone else's work and that's like his whole thing. And it's like, how do you present that?
Right. Very good. Yeah, someone mentioned that now, oh God, pieces are very like someone mentioned performance art. Oh, thank you, Blythe. Blythe has one here. Oh, let me say something about Warhol before I forget it. Babette, isn't it ironic that Warhol now, his paintings, at least his paintings, are some of the most valuable on the market, right? $80 million. But you're right. At first, the Brillo boxes would have been, how do you commodify this? Huge problem. Oh, here we go now. I'm going to take a look at Blythe here. What do we got? Babel. Wow, what the hell is that?
It's like a big tower of like a bunch of like different cassette players and like radios, and like the sound fills the entire room, but every single room as you walk through the collection is like white box, no sound, like very traditionally hung. And then you walk into this room and it's just this piece. The light is blue. It feels really odd, but I like the piece a lot. It's just strange.
That is very cool. I don't know it. Blythe raises Babette, did you raise the sunflower seeds? Or that's a good one too. Blythe shared that. Thank you. Are those sunflower seeds, are they made of porcelain?
I think so. I remember they're all like handmade and individually painted.
Crazy. How do you buy and sell that? I don't know.
I think you can buy like a little pouch of them or like individual seeds. It's really weird.
Sotheby's will not be denied. I have another one here I was thinking of. I'm going to share with you all. There is stuff by this artist in the Ballroom Museum of Art, Felix Gonzalez Torres. This exhibit, Candy. Do you guys know this?
Sorry to butt in, but I've seen this one in the AIC in Chicago, and I was there with pre-college, and our professor got us to go like take a piece of the candy, like each, and like everyone looked at us like we weren't supposed to touch the art, even though like that's the whole point of the piece.
That is the whole point. For those of you who are not familiar, well, do you want to explain it, Blythe? Why don't you explain it?
Yeah, sure. So Felix's partner died of AIDS, and the candy is the exact weight of his partner before his diagnosis. And like throughout the day, viewers are supposed to take candy to show like the diminishing of his weight as he got sicker and eventually died, but it's also like finding joy in those moments of life. Like a lot of Felix's work is like about like morality, but also finding joy and just like the passing of time.
Yeah. I believe the artwork, the piece at the Ballroom Museum of Art by him is like, it's like beads, like, you know, those doors you walk through with beads. I believe that's what his is, but it's been a while since I've seen it. Great. So, you know, he tells us here at the very end of that first essay, the top of 17, he says, you know, contemporary art was a real challenge for curators because now it proposed a different model or a different ideal, you know, or a different standard to think about now when you're presenting artworks. Previously, it was beauty or form. Now it's engagement, right? The artwork engages. It reaches out. You know, but in a totally different way. You know, the philosophical bent of modern art was quite tame by comparison. I mean, Manet and Cézanne, as he has it, were just problematizing the nature representation itself, right? Look at the fact that I'm representing something, right? When you see Cézanne, and Cézanne, what did he do? I mean, he did these pictures that basically capture the ochre and sunsets and the colors of Provence in south of France, right? And you have to, and you look at that and you say, that is a very abstract form of representation of this scene, and I see it, you know. Warhol ups the ante, you know. He ups the ante completely by saying, you know, does this deserve to be art at all? Or what are you really looking for? Or what is art supposed to do, you know, to you and with you, right? It's so much more complicated at this point. In the next essay, you know, he expands on this idea of the historicity of art, and he says that with pop art, this is a big claim that I don't know. What of the things that's so funny about the way he describes Warhol is like he just makes like Warhol seem like this prophet, and yet when you when you see interviews with Warhol, he's like he doesn't crack a smile. He doesn't say much at all. It's interesting to wonder what Warhol's intentions were, and I often wonder if these really were his intentions. I mean, what Danto credits him with. But on page 21, he says that thanks with pop art, contemporary art was the end of 6 centuries of creativity in the West, right? And he quotes this guy by the name of Hans Belting. Page 25, he talks about talks about an era before art. Oh, geez. Well, we've been talking about after art. What is an era before art?
I think he's maybe saying like the time, like before images were thought of as art, and like the idea of art, the concept of art. And I think maybe it's like this idea of like aesthetics or something, or like beauty. I don't know, like the awareness of form, or like, I don't know. I mean, it's a huge generalization, obviously. I don't know what
You're getting there.
but yeah, something like that.
Anybody want to help her out?
I was gonna say when art was just like thought of as like recording history, like image making was just to record history or to communicate rather than to like serve a progression or a higher purpose.
Well, it was highly bound up with something else. In the era before art took back seat.
Was it like once art or like visual representation left the church, it became art? Like once it left its function of being part of a religious kind of I don't know. Yeah, I feel like once it left the church and was hung out of context of the church, it became art.
And also the idea of like the artist as like a creator, rather than like, I feel like with a lot of religious art, it's like the artist is just kind of like this funnel, but it's coming from this like divine presence. Whereas like with the Renaissance, it was all about like the artist coming into their own as like their own creator, own maker.
The word you're looking for is channel, by the way. God operating through a channel. Good. Jay, I thought this might be of interest to you, going on what you were saying earlier about imagery and God. Take a look at this quote here towards the top of page 25. He even puts a date on it, 1400. That was the era before art. So what are we talking about? After 1400, I guess we're talking about the Renaissance. And when indeed art will start to dabble in more secular themes. Before that date, it was purely devotional, at least in the West. The era of art begins in about 1400 on Belting's view. And though the images made before then are quote unquote art, they were not conceived as such. That's a weird way to put it. And the concept of art played no role in their coming into being. They were made for devotion. Belting argues that until about 1400, images were venerated. They were objects of veneration, but not admired aesthetically. And he clearly then has built aesthetics into the historical meaning of art. So I'm thinking of like Chaucer talks about the people going to Canterbury Cathedral to see the images, the biblical images, because they couldn't read. This was the way those stories, those religious stories were transmitted to them, right? But they certainly didn't go just to admire the artwork itself, the creation.
So do you think that like Danto would consider like Martin Luther like demanding that the Bible was translated as like a push towards like art taking a progression towards becoming art rather than just like iconography and translation?
I don't know. I'm not sure I can answer that question. I was thinking just more in terms of the subject matter. Like in my office at Mike, I have a big painting of Bruegel, and Bruegel, I think it's like a village festival, right? I think the contention is that prior to 1400, in Bruegel painted, I think in the 1500s, right? Or is that right? Anyway, you would not see secular settings even contemplated, right? What's the point, right? That's the question you'd have to ask Bruegel at that point. Someone would say to Bruegel, similarly as the Upper East Siders would ask to Warhol, they'd say to Bruegel, what's the point? Why'd you paint a village scene, right? You didn't have to ask that question of Giotto, for example, or Fra Filippo Lippi, who had done a religious piece, right? You knew why they were doing that. It was an object of devotion. Blythe, do you want to say something more about Luther? I'm interested to hear what you're thinking.
No, it's just something I was thinking. It's like, you were saying that like before, like the Bible was like widely accessible, people would go to see images, and I was just thinking like, like Luther, like demanding it getting translated into German, like may have played like a key role in that, like turn away from like painting religious imagery and channeling God through painting.
Yeah. Don't forget also with Protestantism, and this is probably an idea that'll be interesting to Jay, is that with Protestantism, we really get iconoclasm in the West, right? Here's what you have to understand, y'all. Catholicism is not iconoclastic. Catholicism is the opposite, right? You go into a Catholic church, there are saints all over the place, saints with their heads off, saints with arrows in them. Jesus is looking at you, Mary, Joseph, their eyes on you everywhere. Go into a Dutch Reformed church in Holland, blank walls. Go into a Quaker meeting house. You don't even know it's a meeting house, it's just a house with the benches, right? So suddenly, and this is something I've often thought about, but I don't really understand because I'm not a historian of art, but I'm interested in religion. Islam and Judaism, they practice iconoclasm, right? They have prohibition on depicting the face of God or any imagery, of holy figures. Not so Catholicism until the Reformation. Why? Well, presumably because Luther and Calvin believed that there was something sinful, right, in trying to depict God. So that means necessarily, Blythe, that art is going to have, is kind of nudged out the door. It's going to have to start to depict other things. And indeed, look what's going on in Calvinist Holland in the 1500s, right? What is Vermeer painting? What is Rembrandt painting? And when I think of Dutch art from the 1600s, I think of the still life paintings. They're not religious. They tell a moral, but they're not obviously religious, right? How does that sound? Anybody have any comments, questions? All right. So we have an era before art. Art was unself-consciously attached to religion prior to 1400. Didn't have to justify itself, right? Suddenly it was in the business of justifying itself, which is philosophical of its nature. Of course, from 1400 until Manet, what is the agenda of art? What's the aim? What is good art? What does good art do from 1400 until modernism?
Well, it's very I was just gonna say, it was very focused on like the most beautiful representation of the human form.
Good. Jennifer?
To mimic the nature, like what have already exist, the object or people or the scene, like make more like realistic, more photography, something like this.
Verisimilitude, right? Verisimilitude meaning what you create looks as close to the truth as possible, right? There are advances in perspective, right? As realistic as possible. You're trying to paint things as realistically as possible for the most part, in order to celebrate beauty, right? And this falls apart with modernism. With modernism, this is no longer on the agenda at all. And in this this second essay, the second chapter, he says that, you know, this leads to a different way to describe modernism. He says that modernism becomes the age of manifestos, the age of manifestos. Why does he call it this? What's this all about?
This has I think he's speaking to like during this time of manifesto, it's like each individual artist could kind of declare their own lineage and their own like future and past and kind of like predictors of what is and is not. And just like could basically justify any of their practices inside this kind of idealized statements of justifications.
Good. Anybody else? What's a manifesto?
I feel like it's, well, I don't know the exact definition, but like kind of like a statement of like truth, or like what they agree, like what they think is truth. Like with the age of manifestos is like each new style was like, this is the one true style, and this, and like relates it to like all facets of life, and it's like, this is the one true way. And then the next one would come along and be like, no, this is the one true way.
The best part of this chapter, all the quotes. Did you see the quote from Pete Mondrian? What he says at the bottom of page 26, true art, like true life, takes a single road. In other words, my way or the highway, right? Each group thinks that it is doing art. Here's another quote. This is on page 28. Each of the movements was driven by a perception of the philosophical truth of art. That art is essentially X, and that everything other than X is not, or is not essentially art. So each of the movements saw its art in terms of a narrative of recovery, disclosure, or revelation of a truth that had been lost or only dimly acknowledged. Each was buttressed by a philosophy of history that defined the meaning of history by an end state which consisted in the true art. History has been leading up to me, Mondrian. Done, right? Here you go, blammo. There's also a beautiful quote by Rothko. Anybody catch the quote by Rothko? What did Rothko think of his art? And boy,
he said he was making art that would be timeless.
That would last for 1,000 years, right?
Right.
Just imagine. This is on the top of page 30. Where is it? Yeah, the very bottom, bottom 29. That he and his peers, that means he and the abstract expressionists, okay? So I want to pull back a little bit from these individual artists, but they see themselves as initiating or part of a school, that we're now really doing what art is. So Rothko and he and the abstract expressionists, they were producing an art that would last for 1,000 years, the bottom page 29. They were doing art that would last. Years. What do you think of that statement? How does that make you feel? No?
That they need to sit down and think about their own morality. Meanwhile, like instead of like projecting that onto the art world. You're
being so kind. it's hugely hubristic, right? Like Picasso and those guys, they were playing around. But what I'm doing will last for 1,000 years. Now, I don't know much about the abstract expressionists. I'm guessing they were big, bad egotists. I've heard they were quite chauvinist. But, just think this is how, but it's not entirely different from the way Mondrian viewed himself, right? Like, now we're doing art. Those other yahoos, those impressionists and Monet and Pissarro, I don't know what they're doing, but this is art, right? This is gone, right? You all are liberated from this. Yes? Oh boy. I'm not getting an affirmative no. Do you guys still deal with this kind of stuff?
I think in the like world of quote unquote ultimate freedom, it's not that then liberates you from figuring out your placement or your practice in place of others, which I think is what Danto starts to kind of refer to with Rothko's statement of like, sure, his work would last for thousands of years, but that's there has to have been an awareness, and there obviously is now an awareness that there was a lot of other things going on. I don't know. I'm not totally haven't totally articulated this in my mind, but
Okay.
it's just, I think currently it's like one would think you are liberated from and freed to do whatever, but there's still very much a need for your work to be placed inside of some system, some narrative.
I thought you put that really well, Babette. I mean, what you guys all need to understand is Danto believes that you are liberated now, right? Contemporary art is great because it has liberated you from this kind of bullshit. You don't have to suffer the Mondrians of the world anymore. That's his argument. You don't have ideological or stylistic constraints. You may do whatever you want. Next week, we'll talk about that. How liberating is that liberation? I have honest questions. But it's interesting to hear what Babette said. I wasn't actually prepared to ask that question. Like maybe you are dealing with it still, and I'm not aware. I'm blissfully ignorant since I'm not in your world.
Oh, I mean, if you've met any fine artists and asked them if design is art, they're gonna say like, no. Or like if digital art is art, it's like, no, we're the real artist. I'm like,
okay.
I feel like maybe nowadays, like especially with like social media, like this idea of like having a brand, and like this blend of like high and low art, of like being commercial but also not, and having like a recognizable brand, is not everyone does that, but that's definitely a thing that some artists do.
That's an expectation.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
And in the fine art world, there's still like the tastes of like the higher up curators and gallery like directors of boards that you have to attempt to please. They have their own notion of what contemporary art is.
Good.
Yeah, there's definitely still like institutions that definitely.
Let me just be clear. We're not talking about, this is good art versus this is bad art. We're talking about this is art. That is not art. We're talking about that distinction here, right?
oh yeah, we still have to deal with that. One of my friends was at SCAD and they had a like first year experience where there was the quote unquote fine artist, and then there was the people who were in design and illustration. So they had to work on a forum together, and they had to comment on each other's things. And I remember one of them being very, very upset because there was like, yeah, I got my illustration got kind of like shat on, but then I went to look at this girl's things, and it's just like she put paint on her body and just painted with her boobs, and then like it's an ink blot painting, and it's like, this is true art. And like that would be fine usually, but then she also goes on other people's pieces. I was like, this isn't real art. Like, how can you do this? This isn't like anything. And it's like you're selling out your artwork, and like this is like a cop out. This is fake.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh. In other words, they're insufferable.
Interesting. Okay. You raised some interesting point there, Jay. He says, Danto argues that what distinguishes contemporary art is the intellectual agenda, right? The philosophical agenda, basically asking the question, is this art? What is art? But you point out issues, you reference issues of like style and technique. And he doesn't talk about that, right? This is where Danto's shortcoming is mirrored by mine. Danto is a philosopher. He wasn't even a philosopher of art. He got into philosophy of art later in life. So it's a little bit curious that when he's talking about what qualifies as art, he doesn't talk about technique. But I would like to hear about that maybe next week. Hear what you have to say about the importance of technique at going, because basically I'm wondering, like, what role does technique and skill play in defining art as art, right? I could put paint on my forehead and basically mash it onto a piece of paper. Does that take much skill? I don't know. Am I making an intellectual statement? Maybe. I don't know. I'm just asking questions right now, which is what I do. But I think that's all I'm gonna. I think I'm going to leave it there for today because we're near the end of class, and maybe just take a minute or two and see if you guys are understanding where he's going with this, or if there's any questions. One last point there about the last chapter. Basically, he points out that we have three different ages of art. You have the era before art, which Belting points out. Then you have the age of imitation. That's the age from 1400 up until Manet. Then you have the age of manifestos. And then you have the age, then you have contemporary art. Those are the three ages. And in your final essay for today, this he takes up the issue of art criticism, because obviously contemporary art is going to give art critics a headache, or at least it must have at the very beginning, right? When you're an art critic in the age of imitation, your job's easy. Does that look like representation reality? You did a great job, Mr. What's your name? El Greco. Perfect. Beautiful. Goya. Good job. Manifesto. How does an art critic operate in the age of manifestos? Basically, each successive movement defines what art is. Okay, what movement are you? Abstract expressionism? Cool. Are you meeting the goals and the philosophy of that movement? Then I think this checks out. Okay. Contemporary art, no standards anymore, right? But again, this is where I would love to hear what you all have to say about skill and technique. Like maybe that comes into play here. And, as a novice to, someone not familiar with contemporary art, I'd love to hear what you have to tell me next week about how critics appraise contemporary art. Okay. And if that sounds like Danto, if it sounds like what he's talking about, if that's the kind of freedom he has in mind. Okay. So any last questions or comments? No? Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to leave you here for the week, and I will see you next week. Okay. Your reading for next week will also be in Danto. We'll talk about the museum is going to be a major topic for next week. And we'll dig deeper into Warhol, and I will get that video of an interview with him. It's highly interesting and entertaining. Okay. So I'll stick around if anybody needs to chat with me about anything. Otherwise, I would let y'all go. All right. Have a great week. Enjoy the snow, sleep, whatever you got going on.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Thank you.
Good luck with your tire, Babette.
Thank you.
Thank you.